Welcome to the fourth video in our series where we take a look at the sidebar codebase using Vulcan.js. And in this video, after looking at the overview of all the features, the client and modules directory, the server directory, we'll look at the components directory, which contains all of our React components that make up the app. So let's bring up Visual Studio and take a look here. So as you can see, just like our modules directory, the components directory is kind of organized according to the different models and features of the app. Let's start with the posts because that's where the actual homepage is. And I'm not going to go through every single component because that would take a long time. But let's just pick a few and see what's going on. So here, one thing to note is we're using the use query Apollo hook. Here, Apollo React hook, and we are using that to query our special homepage posts custom resolver, which I talked about in the previous video. Basically, it's a way to cache the homepage by just loading a big bunch of data and not having to hit the database every time because it's cached. So we are using that, and then once this is loaded, we are passing it to this post days component, which is defined right here. And all the components you can see below are just basically how we accomplish this layout, where if I look at the actual production side here, you have this zone here for the content, and on the right you have the sidebar with the date and a widget which can change, and is mostly empty most of the time, and then it alternates left and right. But this is basically a way to have these 5 links every time. And so there's a bunch of logic to do this, to group the links, sort them. Some of this stuff could be done server side too. Maybe that would make more sense. So we already get like a pre-grouped and pre-sorted list. In the future, it might be how I do it, but for now, a lot of it happens in the client. You can see here I'm sorting by date and mapping that, and you get the idea. That's how that special sort is done. Another thing we can look at is the post list component, and that component is the one that powers these pages where you just have a list of posts for categories or domains or dates. And here's how it works. First, we look at the different parameters that can be passed via the URL, and that goes back to our routes page here, file. Oops, let's ignore this. Depending on if it's a domain route, category route, you'll see that we have different parameters in the URL, and based on this we set different parameters, different options for our input object. And that input object will then be passed to this special Paginated List component right here, and that's what takes care of loading the actual data. So this is, as you can see here, because it's part of the components object, it's one of the pre-made Vulcan core components. So there's a bunch, such as this one, Paginated List, which loads a bunch of data and then gives you pagination if needed. There's a data table, which we'll look at later. There's forms, there's modal windows, there's buttons. Basically all the basic components that you would have in framework like Bootstrap, which is what I'm using here. In addition to that, a few like dynamic smart components like these guys. Sorry, the screencast thing is making my laptop run a bit slow. So what else do we have here? We have the post submit file, which contains the form, again belonging to that components object imported from Vulkan core, meaning it's one of the Vulkan components. And here we pass it a collection. Again, it's a model which will inform which fields we see. Here we also explicitly specify a list of fields because we don't want to show every option for creating a post, sorry. It's hard to keep everything straight, but I'll do my best. So yeah, fields. So we specify the fields in the form for the post. And then we also specify a callback that will redirect the user to /submit/thanks, which by the way is here, and it's just a small notification. Another interesting concept we have here is the idea of post cell. So this is something I've been playing with lately, influenced by another JavaScript framework called Redwood.js, and I saw that this is something they were doing. They defined how to display a post or comment or whatever in any situation, and how the loading state should look like, what the component should look like. And I came up with the idea of defining variants, so small, medium, and large. The idea being that if you just have to define a post in a really small amount of space, you would use the small variant, which maybe only shows you like the title, and then medium will be more, a more expansive view of the data, and large, I don't know if we have large. Yeah, large isn't done yet, so it only shows the title, but large would be the fully detailed view. Not really relevant for posts because posts aren't that big, but you can imagine if those were blog posts, you could have the full post as the large view. But in Sidebar's case, although I use the word post, link would be more accurate. They're just links with a really short description, but there isn't like a full blog post behind them because they're outbound links. So that's the cell, and we use that cell in the data tables mainly, but you can imagine you reusing it in different places. Again, this is kind of a new concept. It's not fully fleshed out, it's not quite documented, but as time goes, I'm hoping to use it more and more. And if you're curious what a post cell looks like, well, this is the medium version of the cell, and if I'm not mistaken, I think this would be the small version of the cell, which you can see in the newsletter's dashboard. So what else do we have here? We have the sponsor flow. A few interesting things with the sponsor flow. So let's go here. Sponsor, submit sponsored link. Let's just use one of the actual sidebar links for today. So a couple things are going on. First, you can see we preloaded some data. We crawled basically this shiftnudge.com site to load the title, description, and so on. And we also show you a preview here. So the preview works through here. Let me remember how that works. Yeah, basically we are overriding some of the components of the form. So here you can see it's the same kind of form as we had for the post submit form, except we're passing this components prop, which lets us override inner form components. And as you might imagine, this is not just one big component, right? It's React, so we break things down in components, label, input, groups, submit, and one of these is the layout. So we replace the layout by a custom form layout that shows this preview right here. And because the layout of the form and basically every component, every subcomponent of the form has access to the current document, we're able to show you your preview of the data inputted here. I also mentioned that we are showing a preview, and that is done through the URL field. And let me remember where this is. Right, so URL input is a custom form input that takes a URL and then runs a bunch of handlers. So whenever you blur the field, meaning you click out or tab out of the field, it will look at the URL. It will call this get URL metadata mutation. So this is a GraphQL mutation. I'm not entirely sure why it's a mutation because it doesn't actually mutate anything on the server. But anyway, for now, let's just go with the flow. So it's a mutation, and you pass it a few. Oh, right, sorry, it's a mutation because there's an argument. So we do need to use that. So we pass the URL argument, and we get the metadata in return, and we update the other form fields with the data we got back from the server. Use register mutation, by the way, is a Vulkan hook for using mutation, a GraphQL mutation, and this is almost the same as doing it with you know, the Apollo hook, but it lets us avoid having to actually write the GraphQL code because we can just pass these properties. So that's a really cool example of a custom form input that's doing kind of advanced thing where you affect the value of other fields. Let's move on. What else do we have? Let me close this first. We have our sign up form for the newsletter. This is kind of a random fun little messages that I wanted to show. Right here, and I'm not using all of them yet. Some of them are a little bit cringy, so I didn't want to use them until I rewrite them a little bit. I also had the idea of having a system to make sure you get a random one, but one that you haven't seen yet, and maybe telling people like, hey, congratulations once you've seen all the messages, but I haven't implemented that yet. So this is kind of a work in progress, at least as I'm recording this. It might change by the time you look at the actual code, because again, it's not like an example project, you know, frozen in time. It's actually the live code base that I'm using every day. Maybe let's finish with a look at the admin UI. Basically everything under here. The main one being the post dashboard right here. And the main thing here will be the data table component. Okay, scroll down here. Components.data table. We define which collection we want to show, and in theory this is enough to get a working data table. In fact, I think there are some examples where it's much simpler. Yeah, as you can see, like most of this is commented out, so this is actually the equivalent of doing this and getting the user's data table. And as you can see, it looks very messy because it's just trying to do the best it can with the schema and generate something from that, which is why it's displaying all the fields and kind of trying to guess how to display the data. If it's an image, it will try to display it and so on. So this is an example of what you might call a raw data table, like what it's doing out of the box, but you can customize it into something much more usable, which is what's happening here with the posts data table. So let's look at that. And you can see all the options. Show select adds this little column that lets us do things with the items of the table. In this case, it brings up this send newsletter button. Columns is something you'll probably use a lot. If you're using the data table, it lets you specify which columns to show instead of just showing like every possible field of the documents. And you can select not only the fields, but also how to display them. So you can pass a component. You can see that this is formatted with like the title and the domain. The status is also formatted with a special little button here. And you can do all that by passing just React components that will define how you display those fields. There's some other options like whether a field is, or a column rather, is filterable or sortable. And you can see that appear right here. Sort by clicks. Oh, okay. Didn't work. But you get the basic idea. And what else can you do? You can pass an initial state for the data table, meaning how it should be sorted and filtered. You can pass options for the new and edit forms, which appear here and here when you click those buttons. And again, like before, like we saw with the form component, you can pass a components object which will override the different components inside. So submit selected, for example, is the component that appears right here. And in this case, I guess the default doesn't really do anything, so it's meant to be overridden. And here we have this data table submit selected that opens a modal window that itself contains this create newsletter form. So this is a way to, have this additional action that you can do besides just, new and edit, by letting you select posts and act on them. Another thing we have here is this button that contains these 3 actions: approve, spam, and suggest sponsorship. And so if we look at the actions column, you can see there's an action component somewhere. And again, we're using those registered mutations to do actions on the server. In this case, approve a post to be published, or mark it as spam, which also like sets a flag on the user who submitted the post, so we don't get even more spam. Yeah, so that's an overview of the components. Really quickly, you have other admin screens here. You have a layout. This is a useful way of not having to duplicate code too much, because as you can see, it's not using the same layout as the user-facing part of the site, which has this, narrower width and this different nav bar at the top. So the layout lets us do that. We have categories. Again, we have that concept of cell where we define how a category should be displayed in different settings. We have, some static pages, a leaderboard page. And yeah, that's about it for the components. So most of them are going to be really like regular React components with a little bit of Vulkan magic sprinkled in, which you can see here with the loading component, for example, and that's in the avatar component. So that's really light on the Vulkan specific code. Most of it is going to be exactly what you would have in a regular Apollo React app. And that's cool because it's a way that you can quickly get up to speed if you're familiar with those technologies already. you can code your app as usual and then just sprinkle in that Vulkan stuff when you need it. Usually when you need specific components, forms, data loading, and so on. But even then, you can use your own data loading. Here I'm using, again, use query from Apollo hooks, or you can use your own forms, you can use your own components. There's nothing that really forces you to use the Vulkan ways of doing stuff, unless, of course, you want to. So that's an overview of the more front-end centric part of the app, the components. Yeah, I encourage you to take a look by yourself, kind of browse around. And if anything's unclear, you can come ask in our Slack chat room. That's probably the best place. Or just hit me up on Twitter at SashaGrief. Or, leave a comment here on YouTube. Why not? Thanks for watching. I hope this has been useful. This concludes the first series of videos on this codebase. I think I might do more videos on specific topics, in the future. But for now, hopefully that will be enough to get you started. Thanks for watching, and happy Vulcaning. Is that a word? I don't know. Let's say it is.